In this episode, we're going to build a skill that can feel intimidating to beginners, taking a technical risk and explaining it in business terms so clearly that an executive can understand why it matters without needing a technology background. Many new learners assume executives are not interested in security details, but that is not quite right. Executives care deeply about security when it affects outcomes they are responsible for, such as revenue, trust, legal exposure, operational reliability, and strategic growth. The problem is that technical language often hides the outcome behind jargon, which makes risks sound either confusing or exaggerated. Your goal is to translate, not to simplify into nonsense, but to connect the technical situation to real consequences the business can recognize. When you can do that, decisions get faster because leaders understand what is at stake, what choices exist, and what the organization gains by acting. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A technical risk is usually described in terms of a weakness, a threat, and a potential exploit, but business impact is described in terms of harm to outcomes. The technical description might involve a vulnerability in a system, weak access controls, misconfigured permissions, or a lack of monitoring. Those details matter to the people fixing the issue, but executives need to know what could happen if the issue is exploited, how likely that is, and what it would cost. Business impact can include financial loss, downtime, reputational harm, regulatory penalties, contract loss, fraud, and loss of customer trust. The translation process is about moving from how the risk works to what the risk does. A beginner-friendly way to remember this is that executives do not need a wiring diagram. They need a forecast. A forecast tells them the range of plausible outcomes and the decisions they can make to reduce harm. When you provide a forecast, you meet them where they are. To translate effectively, you need to identify the asset at risk and why it matters to the business, because risk without context is just noise. The asset might be customer data, payment systems, intellectual property, employee information, or the availability of a critical service. Each asset is tied to a value driver, such as revenue, trust, compliance, or reliability. For example, customer data connects to trust and legal exposure, while a payment system connects to revenue and fraud risk. When you name the asset and the value driver, you immediately ground the risk in business reality. This step also helps you avoid a common beginner mistake, which is describing a technical flaw as if it is automatically catastrophic. Not every vulnerability threatens critical assets, and executives make decisions based on criticality. When you connect the risk to a critical asset, your message becomes more credible and more actionable. Next, you translate the threat and the attack path into plain language that highlights what the attacker could achieve. The technical story might involve exploiting a vulnerability to gain access, moving laterally, elevating privileges, and exfiltrating data, but executives do not need those steps in that form. They need the outcome, such as unauthorized access to sensitive information, interruption of a service, manipulation of transactions, or misuse of privileged accounts. The key is to describe capability rather than mechanism. Instead of saying remote code execution, you can describe it as the ability for an attacker to run their own instructions on a system and take control of it. Instead of describing a misconfiguration in detail, you can describe it as a door that is open wider than intended, allowing access to people who should not have it. This style keeps truth intact while removing unnecessary complexity. It also helps executives see the risk as a business problem rather than a technical puzzle. Once the risk is clear, you connect it to impact by describing what would likely happen if the risk is realized, including both immediate and downstream consequences. Immediate consequences might include data exposure, service disruption, or fraudulent activity. Downstream consequences might include incident response costs, legal notification requirements, customer churn, regulatory investigations, lost deals, and internal operational disruption as teams scramble to recover. A crucial strategic move is to avoid dramatic language and instead use realistic outcome categories. Executives have heard exaggerated security warnings before, so credibility matters. Credibility comes from being specific about what type of harm is plausible and why it would follow from the risk. You can also talk about scope, such as whether the impact would affect a small internal function or a customer-facing critical process. When you describe scope and consequence calmly, leaders can weigh trade-offs more effectively. Probability is part of translation too, but probability must be handled carefully because beginners often treat likelihood as a guess. A better approach is to speak about likelihood in terms of conditions and exposure. For example, a risk is more likely if the system is internet-facing, if similar vulnerabilities are actively exploited in the world, if access controls are weak, or if the organization has limited detection capability. A risk is less likely if the system is isolated, heavily monitored, or requires multiple unlikely steps. Executives do not need a perfect numeric probability. They need a defensible statement about whether this is a low, medium, or high concern and what factors drive that assessment. This helps prevent two common errors: treating every risk as urgent and treating risk as unknowable. Strategic translation shows that risk is accessible with evidence, even if it is not perfectly predictable. On the exam, answers that acknowledge likelihood drivers without pretending certainty often match strategic expectations. Another critical part of translating technical risk into business impact is framing the decision options, because executives are decision makers, not troubleshooters. A strong translation includes what can be done, what it will cost in time and resources, and what benefit it provides in terms of reduced impact or reduced likelihood. Options might include fixing the underlying weakness, adding compensating controls, reducing exposure by limiting access, improving monitoring, or accepting the risk with documented rationale. The best approach is to provide a small set of clear options rather than overwhelming leaders with dozens of technical tasks. Each option should connect to business outcomes, such as reducing downtime risk, reducing the chance of data exposure, or improving the ability to recover quickly. When you present choices this way, executives can engage productively because they see a path to action. This is how translation becomes influence, because it enables decisions rather than just raising alarms. It also helps to understand that executives often think in terms of risk appetite and opportunity cost. Risk appetite is the amount and type of risk the organization is willing to accept to achieve goals. Opportunity cost is what the organization gives up by spending resources on one thing instead of another. When you translate a technical risk, you should implicitly respect these concepts by showing how the risk relates to the organization's priorities. If the organization is focused on growth, you might emphasize how a major incident could disrupt growth and damage trust, which would be a direct threat to the strategy. If the organization is focused on efficiency, you might emphasize how preventable incidents create expensive firefighting and wasted time. This is not about tailoring truth. It is about connecting truth to what leadership is already trying to achieve. When executives can see how the risk collides with business goals, they can justify investment without feeling like security is a separate agenda. A common misconception among beginners is that translating risk means removing all technical terms, but some technical terms are useful if they are explained correctly and tied to impact. The key is to avoid leading with jargon and to avoid assuming the audience shares your definitions. If you must use a technical term, you use it sparingly and immediately connect it to a business outcome. You also avoid turning the conversation into a seminar, because executives are usually making decisions under time pressure. Good translation is concise but complete, meaning it includes the asset, the threat outcome, the likely impact, and the decision options. This is similar to telling a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The beginning is what we are protecting and why it matters. The middle is what could happen, and the end is what we can do about it. When you structure the message this way, it becomes easy to grasp even for non-technical leaders. Let's look at a simple example to make the translation process feel tangible. Suppose a technical team finds that an internal system has weak access controls that allow too many people to view sensitive records. The technical risk is unauthorized access due to overly broad permissions. The business translation begins by naming the asset and the value driver. The system contains sensitive customer information, which is tied to customer trust and legal obligations. The threat outcome is that an insider or compromised account could access and copy that information without detection. The business impact could include regulatory penalties, mandatory notifications, reputational harm, and loss of customer confidence, even if the exposure is limited. The options might include tightening access to only necessary roles, adding monitoring to detect unusual access, and setting a timeline to redesign how access is granted. Notice how the technical truth is still present, but the message is centered on outcomes and decisions. That is what executives can grasp quickly. Another example is an availability risk, such as a critical service that lacks a reliable recovery plan. The technical issue might involve limited backups, unclear recovery procedures, or dependency on a single system. The business translation begins with the outcome. If this service goes down, customers cannot complete transactions, support volume spikes, and revenue is lost for every hour of downtime. The likelihood is driven by exposure, such as whether outages have happened before or whether the system has known fragility. The decision options focus on resilience, such as improving recovery readiness, reducing single points of failure, and clarifying ownership during incidents. Executives can understand this quickly because it ties directly to revenue and customer experience. This also shows why strategic security often cares as much about recovery as prevention, because recovery protects outcomes even when prevention fails. Exam questions often reflect this, asking you to choose approaches that protect business continuity rather than only focusing on stopping attacks. A powerful translation tool is the concept of business impact categories, which helps you speak consistently across different risks. Categories can include financial impact, operational impact, legal and regulatory impact, reputational impact, and strategic impact on long-term goals. When you translate, you do not need to mention every category every time, but you can choose the categories that matter most for the risk at hand. A fraud risk might emphasize financial loss and trust. A compliance risk might emphasize legal exposure and contract loss. A resilience risk might emphasize operational downtime and revenue disruption. This category approach prevents you from rambling because it gives you a mental structure for impact. It also helps you compare risks, because you can see which ones threaten multiple high-value categories at once. This kind of clarity is often what the exam is testing when it asks you to prioritize or justify actions. To wrap up, translating technical risks into business impact is the skill of turning mechanisms into outcomes and turning outcomes into decisions. You begin by identifying the asset at risk and why it matters to the organization's value drivers. You describe the threat outcome in plain language, focusing on what an attacker or failure could accomplish rather than the technical steps. You connect the outcome to realistic business consequences, including scope and downstream effects, and you speak about likelihood using evidence and exposure factors rather than pure guesswork. You then present clear decision options that reduce likelihood or impact and that fit within business constraints and risk appetite. You avoid jargon-first communication, you keep credibility through calm specificity, and you use impact categories to keep the message structured and easy to grasp. When you can do this, you help executives make decisions quickly and confidently, and you turn security from a technical warning system into a strategic partner that protects what the organization cares about most.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.